Shalom, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special program, Liberation Unfulfilled. It is an uncanny time that we are coming together to discuss this unique topic, the question of freedoms that are given only in a partial sense. We are commemorating this year the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And today we are also witnessing the release of three of our 97 hostages who remain in captivity. And so we dedicate our learning and our hope for freedom to them, those who remain
Mm.
left behind but never forgotten, and for whom we will continue to fight every day and in every way, just as we wish that others had fought for Jewish rights before the Holocaust and, of course, even in the final months. Because on January 27th, which is the day that was selected for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it was not the end of the Holocaust. It was the liberation of what we know as Auschwitz. But Auschwitz was actually a multi camp system, 49 subcamps, Auschwitz Birkenau, combination of a concentration, labor, and extermination camp, where all elements of the Nazi hell came to its fruition, especially within the gas chambers and the killing pits, especially within the persecution of those who arrived to face selection and were forced towards their death. And those who were saved just for slow death, as they say. The selection at the beginning with Dr. Mengele, the photographs that we've seen from Birkenau when the trains arrived and the selections were made. Some were marched directly, as we know, and some were kept alive in order to be a part of the labor system that helped to sustain the network of Auschwitz camps. However, as the Allies started to get closer, and in Auschwitz's case, the Soviet armies were arriving closer, there were rumors on the ground amongst the prisoners. They knew something was happening. They could even sense, shall we say, the fear in the eyes of the Nazis that were their overlords. On January 27th, the camp, known as Auschwitz, the icon of the Holocaust, was liberated. But by then, most of the victims, most of the prisoners, had already been evacuated. The Nazi effort to eliminate the Jews was so focused and strategic that they contrived a means to further murder the remaining witness at minimal cost. Beginning on January 17th, and the largest march taking place on January 19th, the anniversary of today, we know that 56,000 Jews were let out of Auschwitz and put onto what became known as the death marches. Over 700,000 prisoners were marched hundreds of kilometers in the worst of winter conditions, whereby nearly 250,000 perished or were murdered. Those who survived were interned in the camps in Germany proper, the last to be freed by the Allies. Tonight's program, Liberation Unfulfilled, is designed to explore what is referred to as this last phase of the Nazi genocide. Death marches were, in fact, a frequent occurrence in German territories in the entire final year of the Second World War, beginning in the summer of 1944. As the Allied forces pushed towards Germany on all sides, they were using these marches as ways to migrate prisoners from one camp to another. 9 days before the Soviets arrived at Auschwitz, the SS began to evacuate those prisoners from the concentration camps in Eastern Europe, primarily in Poland, to be sent by foot into Germany proper, where they thought that they would be able to utilize the remaining forces and to eliminate as many as they could of these slaved force workers that really were primarily Jews. Of course, there were always others, but workers whose main work was simply to be a part of the network of killing that the Nazis had already put into place and succeeded in murdering over, by this point, over 5 million Jews. What we know is that death marches had even been used during Operation Barbarossa, which is when thousands of the Soviet POWs were actually marched from the Eastern Front to Poland and Germany, and they also were to be used as slave laborers. We know of the death marches of 76,000 Hungarian Jews who were marched from Budapest to Austria to Germany in 1944, and then many marched onward to other locations. These marches became later on the primary method of continued genocide of the Jews, following the liberation of Auschwitz until the final liberation in May 1945. A large share of these prisoners, they were sick, they were malnourished, and they were unable to keep up. Thousands died of exhaustion during the journeys. Those that failed to keep up or showed sign of weakness were murdered along the way. If one bent down in order to scoop up some snow to quench their burning thirst, they would be shot. If they faltered, they would be shot. The longest death marches actually took place at the height of the winter, and so these already weakened prisoners were not equipped with adequate clothing or footwear to survive the cold, and that only exacerbated the conditions that they were forced to endure. Again, post the liberation of Auschwitz, but during the ongoing, continuing genocide of the Jews that we call today the Holocaust. A large share of the prisoners, of course, were also unable to do anything other than support one another, even under these terrible circumstances, just as they had done in the camps. And yet there are stories where one of the marching prisoners died and another would take their shoes to replace the worn out pair that they had been wearing. These types of very realistic behaviors that were happening on these death marches are a part of the human experience that we want to try and understand during the Holocaust and in its final months. We always try to not only dissect the history, but to understand that human experience, how people interacted with one another. How did they sustain themselves during these treacherous times? As the Allies uncovered evidence of large-scale extermination programs as they had arrived at the camps, and actually the first we should recognize had already been liberated in the previous summer when Majdanek, the large labor camp and death camp, was liberated also by the Soviets. By then, they knew the scope of all that had been taking place. The Nazi leadership then decided to order the transfer, dismantling, and destruction of these camps, the equipment, the records, all of it as a means of concealing the evidence of their activities. You see, the deception and the denial. This is commonplace in every faction of historical experience where there is persecution, and then later the persecutors, those who are the bringing about the suffering, want to cover up their crimes. This included also the murder of prisoners who were too weak even to set off on the death marches, many of whom were just killed prior to their departure. And the destruction of camp records is, by the way, one of the reasons why so much of the information about the Holocaust and the victims has been lost, and why denial continues to be a problem. Because without these facts, and without a public that understands this history and works hard to remember the facts, share them, teach them, and make sure that they are being taught and remembered in every possible educational and communal environment, then we are only fueling the continued eradication and erasure of Jews and the continued Jewish suffering in those last months of the Holocaust. The Nazis had often killed large numbers of prisoners before, during, and after the marches. And one of them, for example, during one, 7,000 prisoners, 6,000 of them women, were moved from the camps in the Danzig region that bordered on the Baltic Sea. On the 10-day march 700 were murdered. Those that were still alive when the marchers reached the shores of the sea were actually driven into the water and shot. The liberation that they thought they could feel of that evacuation process, we call it a death march in hindsight. But of course, this was not known to them where they would be going, what they would be directed to on these marches, and who can envision that over 6,000 Jews marched on this March of Liberation, were marched straight to their death and marched to be shot into the sea. On January 19th, when the largest of the evacuations was leaving Auschwitz, there were 65,000 prisoners that had already been transferred. But the last 56,000 that were remaining there, they were transferred within a single week. More than 15,000 die within the first weeks of the death march. And by the time that Auschwitz is liberated, there are only 7,000 prisoners left behind. The photographs that we see often of the liberation of Auschwitz, we see them, there's one of children who are liberated, and there's one of a woman and children who are liberated, and we see these smiles, and yet we know that they were liberated while others were continuing on the path of persecution. In Wrocław, the prisoners were put into unheated freight trains and deported to concentration camps in Germany. But those were few situations. Some of them were marched 250 kilometers to Gross-Rosen. And the rapidity of the Soviet advance meant that some of these death marches were set off with no clear destination. And that was the situation with the evacuation of the Stutthof camp that left on January 25th, 1945. Other prisoners were marched towards Lauenburg in eastern Germany, and they're cut off again by advancing Soviet forces. The Germans forced the prisoners back even to Stutthof, to the camp again. These kinds of erratic behaviors are, of course, having a psychological as well as a physical effect on the prisoners themselves. So again, we ask ourselves every year when we commemorate on January 27th, the liberation of Auschwitz, what are we understanding about the type of murders and deaths that were taking place on the death marches as of January 26th and onward? Over 250,000 continue to be murdered and die on these death marches. After their arrival in the camps in Germany proper, many continued to suffer. Many continue to die. And even after the liberation of those camps themselves, many continue to suffer and many continue to die. These kinds of ongoing details of the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust make it very difficult for us to internalize, because already the Holocaust is so much information that we have to absorb, and too many years have passed where we have narrowed it down to the simplicity of never forget and never again. Learning programs like these that I try to bring are about helping you to delve deeper into some of the factual information, and the death marches are one of them. For that reason, I have crafted a very unique handbook, an e-reader and reflection program that you can use in your home communities. Final Steps and Final Hopes. These are the words of those who survived the death marches. Because after the loss of these extermination centers in Poland, the names of which many of you already know, Treblinka. You know them? Sobibor, Belzec, the gas trucks of Chełmno. If you don't know the names, then we're not doing a good enough job of making sure that we protect the facts of history through our own knowledge. We cannot only expect the public world to care. Not now, while we're fighting another call for the genocide of Jews, And those of you who are watching on Facebook, maybe you already are seeing that we're seeing hate messages arrive even as we speak about memory, because this is the reality of the world we're living in 80 years later. And so when we go through these details, when we try to understand that out of 40,000 prisoners evacuated from the Gross-Rosen camp complex in February 1945, half of the Jews were from the Eulengeberge subcamp. Is that a name you're going to remember? Not easy. But it's important to understand the system and to try and grasp the words and the facts and the terminology that we can. They were all murdered before or during the death marches. That's another 40,000. In northern Germany, in the final weeks of the war, it is estimated that there were upwards of 60,000 prisoners from Bergen-Belsen, Neuengamme, and Mittelbau-Dora who were being aimlessly marched around northeast Germany in search of a safe camp where they weren't going to be liberated by the Allies, where the Nazis could continue their devious plans. At the end of March and the beginning of April, 21 to 23,000 of the 48,000 inmates of Buchenwald were marched hundreds of kilometers to other camps. Thousands of prisoners were murdered then as well. Marches concurrently started in Flossenburg, Sachsenhausen, Magdeburg, Ravensbrück, which was primarily a women's camp, and a number of camps even surrounding Dachau, which is in the immediate vicinity of Dachau, which is in the immediate vicinity of Munich in Germany, and tens of thousands more die. These are large numbers. Can we personalize it? It's very hard to do. In total, you have over 700,000 who were sent on death marches in the final 6 months of the Second World War. The Holocaust, how do we refer to it? And 250,000 perished. After the war, hundreds of mass graves with the corpses of the thousands and thousands that were found all throughout the forests. They were lined up even along the roads sometimes. And the Allies, when they came to continue the liberation, they would actually make local residents stand and pay testimony, witness these dead bodies. They walked them by. You see even photographs of children walking by the piles and piles of dead Jews lined up along the roads because they had turned a blind eye. They had turned a blind eye in the early years when they could have raised their voice against the potential pending atrocity. But unfortunately, too few are aroused to action when the call is for the genocide of Jews. We see it again today, and we make no comparison between the events that we are living through and the events of the Holocaust. But we do want to look at the Holocaust and try and learn from the history so that we can apply it and say, how can we do better in the world we're living in now and the fight that we are fighting? A few more facts that we can put in our library, in our mind, and use in constructive conversations, finding ways to weave through the pain of the memory and the facts that need to be protected. There were about 30,000 who had been marched away from the advancing American forces in Buchenwald. A third of them died, but on April 11th, 1945, the surviving prisoners actually took control of the camp itself shortly before the American forces entered that same day. A fact most people have no idea about. On April 26, 1945, just 3 days before the liberation of the Dachau camp, the SS forces about 7,000 prisoners on a death march from Dachau south to Tegernsee, a camp you likely never heard of. But during the 6-day death march, anyone who couldn't keep up was shot. Anyone who faltered, anyone who tried to help a friend. Others died of exposure, hunger, or pure exhaustion. The American forces liberate the Dachau concentration camp on April 29th, 1945, but it wasn't until early May that American troops liberating the actual surviving prisoners of Dachau from the Tegernsee camp, they had survived that death march. These, again, are the facts that are forgotten by the world. And too many are more concerned to celebrate this momentous day. And we see now today, for the 80th anniversary, there is a major celebration, shall we say, a commemoration that is being planned in Poland. And we know that even our Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, the head of the state of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, was under threat of not being able to attend, because the universalization of the Holocaust has unfortunately become one of the most dangerous elements that we are facing in how we address the future of memory. We are seeing more and more people say that they do not need to know the details. They do not need to know the facts. All they need to know is how to say never again and to apply it to every other group, every other genocide, but to willingly erase the Jew. And we all have a responsibility to prevent that from continuing to happen. Amidst the universalization of a simplistic rhetoric of history, we will lose the truth. You become a part of making sure that it does not ever get forgotten, because these are real issues. And it is a part of the discarding of Jewish human rights and memory, all at the expense of a forgotten part of the final solution, when thousands of potential survivors met their final days. My mentor, my master, Elie Wiesel, his father Shlomo was one such life. And there are many stories that you can learn and read about the death marches. And again, I encourage you to come and look at the resources that we offer at israelforever.org. Elie's father, Shlomo, when Elie had recalled the death marches, he wrote that I was putting one foot in front of the other mechanically. I was dragging with me this skeletal body, which weighed so much. If only could have gotten rid of it. In spite of my efforts not to think about it, I could feel myself as two entities, my body and me, and I hated them both. Interestingly, there are also times when Elie is put in a position that he has to think or second guess himself over his father and how to protect his father. Elie and Shlomo had been placed in the open freight cars, which were exposed to the cold, and they rolled through the German towns past German civilians. Elie wrote, they would stop and look at us with surprise. One day when we had come to a stop, a worker took a piece of bread out of his bag and he threw it into the freight car. Dozens of starving men fought desperately with one another over these tiny crumbs. Many lost their life in the fight, and the workers, the bystanders, watched the spectacle with great interest, even enjoyment. You'll forgive me if I take a moment to realize that even as our hostages are being free, we are watching the entire society there in Gaza celebrate and continue their demonous attacks against three innocent women. And so when I think of this bystanderism that allowed people to watch as men grasped for a few crumbs and fought with each other to the death for a few crumbs, it's just an association that we as human beings naturally might make in our minds, and that is okay as well. A reason I wanted to take a second to mention that is because so many people who I'm communicating with and consulting for are asking me about how to navigate this kind of uneven balance. And since this Liberation Unfulfilled webinar is taking place on a day where we see liberation is unfulfilled for all of our hostages, and yet we have to also relish in the freedom of the three that were released today, thank God, finally. We have to find a way to breathe and to accept and to internalize, to contemplate, and then to think, how do we verbalize this to others who are completely confused, totally disconnected, and have no idea how to cope with these associations themselves. Those of you who are with me tonight learning have an opportunity to take this message onward. Elie Wiesel's father was so weak that actually, when the freight trucks arrived, they thought he was dead. And so Elie slapped him in order to wake him up. He writes, 2 men approached my father, and I threw myself on his body. He was cold, and I slapped him, and I slapped him, and I rubbed his hands, crying, Father, Father, wake up. They're going to throw you into the grave. Having survived for so long, Shlomo managed to wake up, but upon arrival in Buchenwald, he was lost to dysentery and to intestinal distress. He was sick and he was suffering, beaten by the other prisoners as well as one of the other guards. Sometime after Elie woke up the next morning, it was his father that had been taken to the crematorium. And he writes, I stood petrified. What had happened to me, my father had just been struck in front of me, and I had not even blinked. I had watched, and I had kept silent. Only yesterday I would have dug my nails into any criminal's flesh. Had I changed that much so fast? Remorse began to gnaw at me. The conflict that he felt in not being able to save his father and in changing so much as a result of his own imprisonment. These are real issues that had to be faced by every survivor until their last breath. Because one of the things we must remember is that every victim was a survivor until their last breath. Many of you may not even know that after liberation, because of many physical ailments and complete exhaustion, just giving up, or even being from food poisoning because of the food that the Allies sometimes gave to the prisoners was so rich. There's a story of the American soldiers, and they had given out chocolate bars to people who had not had such rich foods, and their stomachs kind of imploded, and people died. You know, those are not counted amongst the millions of dead because they died after liberation. And because maybe we don't have accurate numbers since the Nazis had already begun in January destroying all of the evidence. So we need to use every bit of evidence, and that comes from eyewitness testimony, that comes from understanding, of course, the details of the death marches and the details of the brutality, how the Jews were persecuted, how they were tortured, how they were murdered, so that we know we can learn from their pain and they did not die in vain. The liberation of the Jewish victims of Nazi terror was unfulfilled. Not on January 27th, not on May 5th, and actually not even thereafter. After the liberation, whereas other victims, anyone who was not a Jew, they could go home. After liberation, Jewish prisoners, Jewish victims, had nowhere to go. Yet again, an example of liberation unfulfilled. And aren't we blessed to be able to say that these hostages of today are able to be brought to a home where they can be protected, where we have soldiers and a society and a government and a state that allows us to ensure that there will never be an Auschwitz again. The photos of the liberation that you know are not from Auschwitz. They are from the places that are still bursting at that point from imprisoned innocents. Jews that they were determined to kill to the very last minute and to the very last breath. So we must remember these fateful days in the camps in which from which they marched, where they continued to march, how did they survive? We can look at some of the wonderful recorded testimonies because many of these facts are continuing to be denied. We cannot allow any commemoration, not of the liberation of Auschwitz or even Yom HaShoah, to be dominated by a collective superficial memory. We want to make sure that we grasp the information strongly enough, deeply enough, so that we can do more with that knowledge. We must speak openly about the experiences, even in times when others might find it uncomfortable, because they embody the continued spirit of survival that drove young Jews and old Jews alike further towards the end with the light of hope. What kept so many Jews alive during every phase of this persecution? Viktor Frankl, the famed Viktor Frankl, the psychologist who developed the amazing logotherapy, the method of psychological treatment that determined that one who has a meaning in their life can survive anything. One who has a why can survive anyhow. One of the most poignant sentences from his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And of course, I've read to you from some of the quotes of Elie Wiesel's Night, and Man's Search for Meaning is by Viktor Frankl. And he too talks about how those who were able to fill their days with the light of hope, they were able to endure. Already from the hostages released today, we heard um, Romy Gonen say to the mother of Emily Demari, "You don't know what I would have done without your daughter and how important she was for me." We know that during the Holocaust, finding a friend was a source of survival. And so we know that this is a lesson, not just from the Holocaust, from any persecution for any group, but we are the heirs to the memory of the Shoah. We are those who must inherit, learn, and teach so that the future can be different, so that we can apply these lessons. Yes, there are choiceless choices in each one of these circumstances. And I want to make sure now to give a chance to you, our learning community, to ask any questions you might have about the death marches, liberation unfulfilled, and this complex reality that we're living in today. So we want to address one of the notes that's been added here by one of our participants, that yes, the Nazis were giving themselves an excuse for fleeing, and that they would not be able to, they would not be forced to face the coming Allied forces. We have seen this in many different depictions, even in some fictional depictions of the Holocaust, where the Nazi all of a sudden gets a change of heart and he decides he's going to be involved in helping to save Jews in these last months. Yes, the excuse for fleeing and using a saving of Jewish victims as an excuse for their own behavior. But look, I helped save a Jew at the end of the day. That is an excuse for them. There's even a famous story Simon Wiesenthal tells about how after his survival, and many people get the names mixed up, Simon Wiesenthal is also a survivor. He went on to become the famed hunter of Nazis. When we look at those important activists today who are trying to discover and hold accountable every single terrorist and supporter of terror in the world today, it is much like those who were fighting to find and hold accountable the Nazis who were the terrorists of the Holocaust time. So we know that Simon Wiesenthal was actually brought into an infirmary and asked, because a Nazi asked for a Jew. And he says, "You must forgive me," because he also was looking for an excuse for his behavior, excuse for his involvement in murder. And of course, the excuse of guarding the prisoners was one of the ways that they could join a march and allow themselves to get back into Germany proper and perhaps evade any responsibility for the actions that they had been taken part of. Thank you so much, by the way, for your comments. All of you, please add your questions continuously. We have another here that a survey in the United States showed that actually 20% of Americans under 40 think that the Jews caused the Holocaust. I'm going to top you on this one. Over 60% of adults in the world do not know what the Holocaust was. And 1 in 6 Jewish teenagers could be considered shall we say, a denial apologist, because we are facing a time where people are unwilling to see what we call the writing on the wall. And so they too are looking for excuses. Some people, yes, you're right, they think that a few thousand died and many know nothing about it. But more importantly, people just don't really care. There's a great book that some of you might have heard of, which is People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn, if you've heard of it. There's another by a British author I highly recommend, David Badiel. And it's very important always to know that it's not just the American Jewish experience of anti-Semitism that we should be dissecting, but all over the world. And of course, here I know some of the names that are of the group that are with us, and I know that you are from all over the world. And I'm so grateful for this incredible opportunity to have a global community of virtual citizens of Israel that really reflect the diversity of not only our Jewish community, our Jewish people, but also the friends of our people who come to learn with us and to be a part of it. We want to make sure that we are recognizing that, as David Badiel's book, his title is Jews Don't Count. So most people don't know about the Holocaust, and most people are simply not interested because so what? What is the impact on their own lives when all they want to do is to live easy without the burden of this painful memory that really is irrelevant to them? This is a question you should ask yourself so that when you are engaged in conversations with others, listen, not a lot of people want to sit around and talk about the Holocaust, right? Nobody's going to ask you to have a discussion about the death marches. How do you interject that when we are fighting a war for our survival right now? I believe that it isn't about creating parallels, but rather looking at the patterns of history and going earlier than just the several years that are considered to be the Holocaust years, 1939 to 1945. Go earlier than that, a decade, 2 decades earlier, and see the patterns of behavior so that we can then weave our discussions and even now your new knowledge about the death marches, you can weave it in so that one person has new information, more facts that they can say, really? I didn't know that. And you are their teacher. You are their lamplighter. Another comment here, by the way, does add that in our chat that many people don't even know when the U.S. was founded. And that is an ironic truth as well, which just goes to show how important it is that we must get more involved in what is happening in our education systems and with our young minds. We have seen since the announcement of the ceasefire, and again, however one feels about this deal with the devil, we know that innocent life is being saved, and we have to stand and hold our breath and pray that every single one of our hostages will come home and we will be able to eliminate Hamas, every single element of Hamas within that society. But as soon as the ceasefire was announced, what do we see? We see children with Hamas headbands and massive weapons being marched through the street and celebrating Khaybar, Khaybar, oh the Jew. It is an ancient call from Muhammad's attack when he massacred the Jewish communities, when they would call out Khaybar, Khaybar, kill the Jew. So right as a ceasefire is being signed, being declared, hands are shook, and we already see that the hate messages and the calls for Jewish genocide continue. One of the leaders of Hamas going on to proclaim they will bring October 7th again and again and again. So as we try to live within this juxtaposition of Holocaust history and current events, this very uneven balance of identity and confusion that we are facing, how are we supposed to make sense of it? This is my question to you, and I'll continue asking some of the questions you have shared in our chat. How does one simultaneously recognize our heroes while expanding our teaching. People seem to need inspiration in order to listen. I believe, first of all, the best inspiration comes from a direct outreach. If you have a friend that you can send a message to and feel confident to do that, that's step one. We rely too much on social media. It's an external connection. It means I can post it and forget about it. I didn't actually have to make any connection. And since there's so much shadow banning, like our page on Instagram and on Facebook are being shadow banned. What does that mean? That means that our content is being intentionally inhibited from being shown. We have a global community of over 500,000 people around the world, but on average, our content is reaching less than 1% because of being shadow banned. That shadow banning happens because the other teams are very busy with personal involvement and many accounts doing everything they can to report, ban, report, ban, report, ban. But we want so much to be able to breathe and to find some calm in this difficult life of compassion fatigue that we are living through. Who has the energy? And so, how do we recognize our heroes while expanding the teaching of our pain? It is a difficult thing to keep in the balance, and you have to be the inspiration. That's why I do these virtual programs. So, however many people join, sometimes it's 150, sometimes it's 5. And guess what? Every time we get to walk away with good questions being asked, good facts being taught, and good ideas being shared. We want to be able to, yes, is one of the comments here. Let's look at the events from 1929 to 1933. I really want to recommend people to go even further back because it was in 1920 that the National Socialist Democrat Workers' Party, most people know them as the Nazis, but did you know NSDAP, the National Socialist Democrats Workers' Party, they are considered to be far right wing. But the right and left of today does not equate to the right and left of a previous generation. And it doesn't, by the way, equate left and right in one country, doesn't always equate in other countries. We want to stop using these types of labels and we want to increase our specificity. We want to be able to understand some of the relationships that were established in the 1920s, the diplomatic affairs that were happening behind the scenes, because simultaneous to the Holocaust, what was also happening? Jewish rights to our ancestral homeland were also being recognized. 1917, with the Balfour Declaration. You have then in 1920 and in 1922 and in 1924, again and again, Jewish rights are being affirmed simultaneous in Germany to the onset of Jewish rights being negated and that becoming legalized. Now, when we look at the comparisons with today, are we expecting it to look the same? No. And as Elie Wiesel and many other survivors had all written, it will not look the same when it happens again. And we have to stop expecting that. Have you ever thought how social media is kind of like the lists of today? And the doxing that's taking place and the mapping project, check it out. The mapping project, we have it featured, of course, on israelforever.org. You can look at it. It's now they've actually gone ahead and just been very obvious and changed their name. It's the map of liberation. Liberation by identifying Jews, finding their names, finding their addresses, and then knowing where they can be targeted. Is it happening right now on a tiny, tiny scale from what potentially could be growing, much because of the hands-off ignorance of a lot of the world, unwilling to preempt any potential next attack because nobody wants to be paranoid. Nobody wants to be considered an extremist. I asked in a recent reel, for those of you who don't follow, please come and follow us. Help us cross 10,000 followers on Instagram, where I share reels almost every day, informative and inspirational reels, helping you as JM. You asked, that helping you become the inspiration as well. And one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, are you really prepared should something happen in your community? We have in Israel something in every community called a kita konenut, which is like it's translate as preparation class. Every community has a kita konenut, sometimes different levels, where if an emergency happens, they are on the ground. They are there to take care of it. And yes, we have seen what happens when our security networks fail, and that is we are only human. But what will happen if we do not preempt the next phase? Right now, they are calling for liberation tomorrow, January 20th. They are calling to flood 70 cities around the United States. And that's really only on the radar of those who pay attention. And of course, not recognizing also the calls to flood every other major city from London, Sydney, Melbourne, throughout Europe. We are seeing it grow. How does it relate to the death marches? How can we make this leap of thought? Because just like we've been allowing for 20 years the memory of the Holocaust to be dominated by the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yom HaShoah, that's what we honor as Jews. We come together in our communities. Yes, there are the days of remembrance for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC and other museums around the world, but they too are universalized. This year's Holocaust Remembrance Day theme is to focus on the genocide in Bosnia. But shouldn't it be about the Holocaust? Or are we so unwilling to protect the rights of Jewish memory that it's just overshadowing how little we are allowing people to care about Jewish rights as a whole? There is a new book, as one comment here, Bernard Henri Levy, a voice that many can be inspired by. Really, he is phenomenal. Israel Alone. And yes, there are details about those who collaborated with the Nazis that are largely unknown. And I encourage people to be aware. But what do we do with this awareness? Memory is only as good as how we apply it to prevent future genocides, future threats. We are already living in that future as we cross this 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. We are actually coming together tonight to remember the 80th anniversary of the onset of the murder of over another million Jews. Between the liberation of Auschwitz until the liberation at the end of all of the camps being liberated in the beginning of May, another million Jews. Should we let them be forgotten? What did Elie Wiesel always teach us? Those who forget the dead, it is akin to killing them a second time. We must make sure that in our knowledge, we incorporate facts, we keep emotional stories, they help with our inspiration. And as I said, I have a resource that I've put out for you that you can learn more of the original witness testimonies from the death marches to help you. You can encourage on International Holocaust Remembrance Day in your community. You are welcome to invite me to come and speak to any community that you might be interested in. And the resource can actually be printed and used in your communities for distribution to expand knowledge, because that is what we must do. And I hear you. Those of you who are saying that direct contact is hard and social media makes it easy, that's why we look at it also as an asset. I'm kind of like that too. A lot of us are living in our isolated bubbles. One of the things that I've learned the most from my virtual citizen of Israel discussions is how many people join Israel Forever because they don't necessarily have a community where they belong or where they feel that they can fit in. And maybe they're afraid and they don't want to go out and be a public Jew, which, yes, we want every single type. We want every kind of voice. We need those who are just be willing to be more active on social media because we're lacking those numbers as well. What would we have done in February 1945 while already many communities in Poland were celebrating liberation and still Jews were being massacred? What would we have done is a very dangerous question because as we look around, and people have been asking this question for many years, what would we have done? We are seeing all around us what most people would have done, which is nothing. And that makes what we do all the more important. In the name of the victims of the Holocaust, in the name of the survivors whose stories will never be told, and for the sake of those who continue to suffer the types of torture that are being imposed on Jews and the violations of Jewish rights, we come together. And I want to thank you for coming with me and being on this journey tonight. I'd like to give you a chance to ask any closing questions. I want to thank you guys for your very, very important comments. I love history. I love being a virtual citizen of Israel. God bless you. These are the kinds of messages that kind of remind us why we do what we do, because sometimes it feels like we're talking to a void and we're posting to emptiness. 1% of our community is actually able to see our content. If you're a social media activist, come be a part of sharing knowledge, sharing truth, sharing inspiration, because that is the hope that gets us through. All afternoon for 4 hours, I sat in front of my TV, swapping between channels so that I could capture every single moment of the release of three gorgeous, beautiful young Jewish women. And I tore myself away. And just before our program started, I was actually on the phone with my mom. And she said, "How are you going to do this?" And I said, "How can I not?" Because it's this kind of work that reminds me, excuse me, this kind of work that reminds me, all of our destiny as the Jewish nation is bound together. And we have to separate October 7th from the Holocaust, but we also have to find our voice in how we can draw these connections. And we have to say, I have to use my voice even if I'm exhausted emotionally. And even if I cry and I embarrass myself in front of all of you who have joined tonight, well, isn't that part of what it means to be human today? So thank you for being a listener and a learner. And thank you so much for those of you who have shared, that you have helped, that I have helped. Yes, people all over the political spectrum are on fire in one way or another. Let's direct it. Let's direct it and give them an understanding that Jewish human rights are worth fighting for, because Israel is fighting for the freedom of all humanity and civilization right now. Our fallen soldiers, we have lost 16 soldiers in 1 week, and we can't breathe. And they are playing psychological terror games with us. 3 hostages every week over 42 days? Who allows a deal like this? You can blame whichever politician you don't like, but the finger of blame must be on the murderers themselves and on their enablers. And that is true during the time of the Holocaust, and that is true today. Those who are complicit, those who are bystanders, those who do nothing with their voice, they too are to blame. It's a terrible deal. And saving a life at the expense of over 1,900 terrorists who are being freed, not to another country, but to right here out my doorstep. We have to know and pray God has a plan. Maybe our government knows something we don't. Maybe they'll be able to prevent all of these terrorists from returning to terror, which we know, by the way, 82% of terrorists who are released in these prisoner negotiations return to a life of terror. The murderer and rapist of Ori Ansbacher, the murderers of the Fogel family in Itamar, the murderer of Ari Fuld, who so many Americans knew his voice because he was an inspiration. And they will walk free and they will commit more terror. And we must be as committed to fighting for Jewish rights, to fighting for Jewish memory, to fighting in every way we can. And sometimes that even means fighting within ourselves and saying, okay, I've got to find the strength to do more. Tonight's program, a little bit heavy, a little bit hard to balance these two realities. I hope I've done some justice to Eli, my master, and his experience on the death march and losing his father days later, and so many voices we can't hear. I hope that your learning tonight has somehow helped as we navigate these challenging times. Thank you for sharing here. There is a writer who has a monthly op-ed column in a Northampton, Massachusetts newspaper, and he writes about anti-Semitism. And thank you so much for willful ignorance. That's right. Use your fingers. Have you noticed, by the way, you got teenagers in your house? Did you know that Teen Vogue, every issue, has an anti-Semitic article in it? Our teenagers are being brainwashed. So your writing, and did I see that Scott is here? Your poetry, wherever your listeners might be, whomever and whatever echelon of society they might be in, your voice matters. Use it. Do more. You are a proud virtual citizen of Israel. That is why we created this global community, so that you could feel that you have a voice and a platform from which to shout from the rooftops. We wish that they had not been silent 80 years ago. Let us not let anyone be silent or be an accomplice, even today or in the coming years, because what we're witnessing now is just the beginning. And we have to be more prepared, and we can be more prepared by learning about history. Thank you so much for joining. It has been interesting to see your questions. I'm just trying to check real quick. I just want to see if I've forgotten any. The worst looks when I wear, I don't know what more to share. The worst looks when I wear my Star of David, and yet I still stand proud. I was once in Munich, and a guy comes up to me and grabs my Star of David. I was on a train, and he grabs me and he, was ist mit dir? In Germany, I speak Yiddish, so I understand German. And he says, "Why are you wearing this?" And I was physically touched by this man's hands. And no, I didn't tell my parents because I stood proud. And my friend who was with me, just put it away. Just take it off. This was 30 years ago. And the situation is only worse. So when we put on our pin, it's like a religious experience, right? And there's a reason why we wear this, and there's a reason why I have like 5, and there's a reason why we wear them, because it's called the Magen David. It is our Magen. It is our shield. We can wear it. We can be proud. Some people won't put up a flag, and that's okay. There you go. You got your blue square. Well done. Everybody's got a little something. You can do more. You can also stay strong, and within your small circle, make an impact so that your children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, friends' children, all of them should be awakened to do more, believe in themselves, and know that our fight is a long destiny fight. We are fighting a 3,000-year-old battle. It's not going to end with us. We're a part of it. Hold your head up proud. just like those who made it through those death marches. They made it to the end. They didn't see their liberation fulfilled, but we can. Let our memory be a part of their continued liberation and the liberation of our children for the future. So thank you so much for joining. Come and always check out israelforever.org. Make sure you're on our mailing list. Follow us on the platforms and be a part of the conversation. Host a virtual conversation for your network, for your book club, for your coffee clatch, for your challah baking group. You never know who you can inspire. Thank you so much. Stay strong, everyone. And may our prayers go out to all of the hostages' families, those released, those who we continue to wait for. And send us your blessings, and you can gift to the released hostage families a beautiful blessings blanket that we have crafted exclusively for them, because there are so many ways that we can make an impact. And I just keep trying to find new ones so that I can help you out there in the world. Let's help each other. Let's be one. Let's be proud. Thank you again for joining tonight. Stay strong, everybody. Stay strong.